listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors where we're extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid.
I'm Rachel Sensenig.
I'm Julie Hoke.
And I'm Ben White.
And I'm glad to be here and together with you. It's an exciting show that we have prepared for you. In the middle of it, I'm going to interview Drew Hart, who wrote this new book, just came out, Who Will Be a Witness, talking about how the church can be an anti-racist force in the world. That's exciting. But we're going to begin with talk back, and then we're going to end with spiritual show and tell. But let's start. Julie, get us going about what we're talking back to, what we're hearing from people.
Yeah, this week we got some inspired talk back from our cell leaders in the church. We were discussing how difficult it is to keep relating online through a screen, whether it's Zoom or Google Meet or whatever platform you use. We're all feeling this fatigue, and they were talking back and offering some real inspired solutions and strategies even for how to survive in this prolonged quarantine. So I'll just name some of the problems I think that we all feel. We all experience them. We can relate to them in some way. And then you guys can share some of what we were hearing as people talked back to it. The first thing that's so obvious is that we lack physical touch. Not being in the same room with people that we're trying to relate to really cuts off a lot of connection and communication.
Yeah, someone said at the Sunday meeting online in the chat on YouTube, actually, that they would pay someone to come and hug them. That was it was funny and sad.
Mm-hmm. It's a common feeling.
So when we're meeting together in these cells, which are, often in people's living room, often you could touch a knee or be together, high five, hug, it's a common place where there's lots of physical connection, even if just like, you're crunched together on a couch or something like that. It can be, really physically connective. And so now we're trying to make these connections without that. And one person thinking about this problem thought that we might have to really play up the emotional content of what's happening here on the video call when we're in a meeting together now, not in a living room, like laugh more, elicit more emotions. You might even, as a leader, overreact. So that was one idea someone had.
I like that. The problem that my group was talking about was how every meeting can look and feel the same because we might be sitting in the same spot and looking at everybody else's same backgrounds. And so like our experiences and days can like run together and be not memorable. And they were coming up with some great ways to address that. And one of them was to use PowerPoint in the meeting as like a common table where you put visual stuff on, like you would put the Doritos on the table at the cell meeting.
That would be cruel. You're going to put a picture of Doritos on the table? I mean, that would be kind of cute and funny or whatever.
Oh, you said cruel, not cool?
No, cruel. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you don't put food on the table, but something else interesting.
Some common experience. Yeah.
Right.
Like that makes it so that something's happening here. Oh, It's not just these faces in their living rooms.
Well, and another idea was that we could do show and tell with each other, like around our house. Like everybody could get a chance to like show their basement or show something else.
Julie shows her basement often. She's often on video calls in her basement.
I hang up a blanket so you can't see.
I can tell you're in the basement. It's so obvious you're in the basement. The blanket doesn't cover your whole background.
But it's a memorable way to get to know each other, even if there are embarrassing things that we don't want to show. That kind of vulnerability kind of helps us know each other.
I'm fine with the way my basement looks, but I'm not fine with the way it smells. No matter how clean I keep my cat's kitty litter tray, I'm embarrassed of my basement.
That's one benefit of Zoom. You don't ever have to worry about how you smell or how your house smells. What about, though, someone else said that you can't lay your eyes on somebody. I loved that phrase. And what she meant was like, you can't feel their energy. So what did people have to say for addressing that problem?
Well, I think you might have to actually connect in another way. Our cells are more than just the meetings. They're more than just what happens in your Zoom call or whatever you do. You might have to go to someone's house and yell at them through their window or talk to them on the porch. Actually that kind of energy transfer. I don't know if it happens through the screen or even over the phone, but it takes an extra effort to actually connect with somebody. And I think this might be true even for like work too. Like the people you work with on your team at work, you might need to go and see them occasionally so you can make stuff together. Like you got to charge up that kind of personal connection a little bit. And you can do that safely. And it'll probably be paltry. It won't be enough, but it'll be something that could juice you up to do cool stuff.
A couple people said that, speaking of that, like little charge of connection, a couple of people said that they are like sending packages or presents, dropping off little things to each other. That's a nice little charge. That's like a personal connection to be thought of. And someone brought my kids cookies the other day. Their kid brought my kid cookies. I even felt that,
My kid's friend rode her bike from West Philly to bring my daughter a Capri Sun the other day when she was having a bad day. And it made her day getting a Capri Sun.
What about meeting fatigue? Lots of people are feeling just general digital meeting fatigue, especially if you work on a screen. Then how do you go about relating beyond that?
I think you got to use your body. Get out, take a walk, take a hike, go on a jog, wear yourself out, because your mind kind of gets worn out by the meeting. That's what the cell leaders were saying, right? Someone was saying deep breathing activities helps them. Doing an activity that's different, singing on the call, even though it doesn't work. Movement. Those are good things to fatigue another part of yourself so that you can. So it actually feels okay to sit down again. That's what they were bringing.
I don't know if anyone said this, but it's kind of a perennial problem with trying to be a leader in the church, is that your job is going to eat you up. If you are trying to do something with the church in the world, it means that you got something that the world also wants. Like the stuff that you give to Jesus to like make love and discipleship happen is the stuff the world also wants for you to make money happen. And
so you're saying the best leaders also have busy jobs or something like that?
Yeah. If you're getting filled up with the love of Jesus and community, you're going to be a better employee and you're going to get more responsibility, and it will be even fulfilling in many ways, especially if your job has a kind of a social thrust, which many of our people's jobs do. But making those boundaries with work, instead of just, working in order to recreate, which is kind of how the system sets us up to do it. You're going to work, and then when you're not working, you better be not working. So negotiating those boundaries and setting up some boundaries against work, against them taking all of your good stuff, because there's other things that you have decided that you want to give some of your good stuff to. I think you should give your good stuff to work. I'm not against your job, but I am for, a holistic you. And there's stuff that you don't have enough to give it all to your job. You're at the very least, your kids need it, but Jesus needs it for the mission of Circle of Hope as well. If you're leading this church, or if you're not part of our church, Jesus needs you to, have a sense of what is my vocation? What is my part to play in the body? I have gifts to offer. And if I give those gifts all to the job or all to something else, I won't have enough to do what Jesus is calling me to do.
One of the benefits of being in this time is that the problems that we face are highlighted. People talked about meeting fatigue before we were on Zoom all the time when we met in person. It's a challenge still. I think the pandemic makes certain things more flagrant, but the human condition is still what it is. You should probably go on a walk anyway during ordinary time, right? These are the things that I think that we're learning even about ourselves too. And also, it might even make our cells and our cell leaders know this. They're shepherds and they're shepherding their people, but they're also including someone else. And someone asked, "How do you even invite someone to an online meeting?" And I said, just the same as you would to your friend's house. By the way, that's also strange behavior, to invite someone to a different person's house that isn't even yours. You know what I mean? Like the inclusion aspect is unusual regardless, And so I don't, our cell leaders are saying, don't make that an excuse to not connect with somebody, give it a shot, because this might still be the best someone can do, even in ordinary time. I have someone in my cell that probably can't make it to Brewery Town, which is a neighborhood on the other side of Philadelphia from where he lives, but he can make it to the Zoom call more easily. So even naming that as a blessing can be good.
Yeah, and I think they were demonstrating some of the joy of that even in this meeting that we're talking about. We started it out with a game, and it gave us a chance to laugh together. And I think that that's an element of all of our meetings, that when we get together, there's at least this potential to to multiply our joy as well as bear each other's sorrows and burdens. So I think we can look forward to that as we save some social energy for the meeting, like Ben is encouraging us to do. We can also look forward to some laughter and joy.
I'm so glad that you're listening to our podcast. It's great to have you as part of our family. I want to invite you to participate with us in a few unique ways. First, if you like the podcast and you want more people to hear it, give us a positive review wherever you listen. If you want to support our show, you can donate money at circleofhope.net/sharing. That'll help pay our communications manager and our pastors who put on this show. If you want to connect with us more deeply, I suggest worshiping with us on Sundays at 5 o'clock. We still do it online during the pandemic. circleofhope.net/online meeting is where you can do that. And if you want to connect with the cell, which is a really basic building block to our community, go to circleofhope.net/cells for more information about that. Many of them are meeting online, so even if you're far away, you can connect. Additionally, if you want to pray along with us, check out circleofhope.net/dailyprayer and /dailyprayerdeeper. It's good to be in a community with you, however disparate it may feel. If you want to connect more, email us at resistandrestoredpodcast@circleofhope.net. Thanks for listening. Share this podcast around with people that you think might benefit from it. Subscribe to our show, and hopefully we'll be hearing from you soon. I'm really excited to have my friend Drew Hart on the show. Drew is a professor at Messiah University, and he's the author of the recently published book, Who Will Be a Witness? It just came out at the beginning of September. It's a great book, and you can buy it right now wherever you buy books. So I recommend that to you. Welcome to our show, Drew.
Thanks, Jonny. I'm glad to be here with you and to catch up.
You and I have a lot in common because we both come to or are rooted in the Anabaptist tradition. And that'll help inform our conversation here. When it comes to anti-racism and Anabaptism, I think that's a unique marriage. And so I'm glad we're bringing that forward and having a dialogue about it today. You begin your book using especially the Gospel of Mark to talk about Jesus's political strategy when it comes to the actions that he did. So in terms of sociopolitical change, how strategic was Jesus? And can you give us examples of that? What do you draw upon to come to that conclusion?
Yeah, so one of the things I do, as you mentioned, I take a close look at the Gospel of Mark, And in particular, Mark is most interesting because on the surface, it seems pretty simple. But when you get a little bit more, read a little more carefully, it's one of the more subversive gospels, much more anti-imperial, and in some ways, a more radical Jesus that we get a glimpse of in the Gospel of Mark. And so I look at the Gospel of Mark and Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, this pinnacle and climax of the gospel, and we see a few things. First, number one, just the fact that he's a Galilean heading to Jerusalem, that in of itself says something, because the Galileans were poor, outsiders, malnourished, struggling, and Jerusalem was the center of action. It was the city. It was the center of religious life, cultural life, economic life, everything, right? And many of the elites in the establishment actually were in cahoots with the Roman Empire as well. And so just the fact that he's going there is he's kind of strategically picking a place that are the pillars of power in his society already. But then you see some particular strategies in place in what he does. First, we see a pretty extended explanation of Jesus's orchestrating getting the cult, right? And so just even the fact that he has this all set up already means that there was some intentionality with Jesus in terms of orchestrating a plan. He had something that he wanted to unravel, and we see that playing out in the Gospel of Mark. Then we see strategic symbolism that in that gospel, one of the things that Jesus does is he literally embodies two things, Zechariah 9 through 10, and also the Maccabees, who were like, by this point, legends, revolutionary legends at that time. And by riding in on a cult that kind of evokes Zechariah 9 to 10, as well as in the way that they did, in the ways that Maccabees did when they came and overthrew foreign powers, it would have evoked a very radical revolutionary consciousness for folks, especially as they're living under the Roman Empire. And then finally, we see just some really strategic discernment that Jesus has in the moment. And so the Gospel of Mark is the only one that describes Jesus as going into the temple, scouting it out. Everyone's all excited. And then he leaves and he decides to go leave the city and then come back the next day. And so we see him kind of scouting it out, realizing this isn't the right timing, waits for the next day to return and come back in, and then causes a ruckus. And so I think that you see just some real intentionality and strategy that I think are really meaningful for folks who are interested in the relationship between radical discipleship and kind of strategic social change that we can be about in our own world.
And in that passage, when he clears the temple in Mark, we see a Markan sandwich, right? Because he curses the fig tree in between.
That's right.
The two temple interactions, which is a symbol of what is happening even in the moment too.
That's right. And so that's how I frame the whole chapter. Instead of only just thinking about the clash and what happens in Jerusalem, I frame it in thinking about his judgment on the fig tree because it's not producing what it ought to, right? And his judgment on the temple because it's not fulfilling its vocation. It's not bearing the fruit that it's supposed to. And so as he curses the fig tree and it withers away, so will this powerhouse, this empire, this establishment, right, that it's not going to last. And there's actually pretty radical implications when you think about that and you think about what are the institutions in our society today that claim to be producing public safety and well-being, but are not actually doing that. And to have the prophetic imagination that these things can wither away and we can replace them with something else.
And depending on when you date Mark, and we'll get beyond this in a second, it's even more radical because it might have even predated the destruction of the temple, which actually happened right in 70 AD. So something radical is occurring there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's still some debates from scholars about its dating, but it's certainly the earliest, and it's possible that it was certainly before that or during, where it was unsure what was going to happen. And so these are radical statements from the Gospel of Mark to take that stand.
And if you're wondering about the temple exchange rate and why that was problematic, Drew in his book, well, we're not going to mention it now, but go buy his book and read about Chuck E. Cheese. It's a perfect example of what's going on in the temple.
Yeah.
So you and I are both Anabaptists. And I hear this a lot. Maybe you do too in your circles. How do you reconcile Jesus's participation in political action with what we sometimes hear as an insistence that Anabaptists not participate, an insistence on quietism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, there's no question that North American, or I should say white North American Anabaptism has been very domesticated. That their capacity to engage in the public square is very limited compared to even the 16th century, where you have a whole wide range of responses that Anabaptists are engaging in. In fact, you could argue that the Anabaptist movement is in some ways tied to and connected to the peasant rebellions that are happening at that moment. So that's a whole nother story. But I think that the domestication of North American white Anabaptism has so domesticated it so that it has turned into a kind of quietism and a centrism that's really not helpful. And I think, when I think about ways that those same Anabaptists that might take that position were willing to, lobby for the government to not conscript them to war, right? Conscientious objection. They were willing at times to engage the government in politically when it was going to impact them. And so it's very interesting in what ways people believe we should or should not engage. But I think even more than that is to have a distorted definition of political action altogether. And is to imagine that the only kind of political action is a top-down coercive engagement with society. And what we see precisely in the person of Jesus, when we engage in radical discipleship to Jesus, is a broadening of the definition of political. And it's a confrontation, and it's a prophetic witness, and it's solidarity with the oppressed, and it's participating in God's liberation and justice in the world. And it doesn't have to be a coercive project where we're trying to institute Christian supremacy over others.
I think one of the ways that even in the text you draw a comparison between different kinds of political action is in a very interesting comment about Barabbas and Jesus and how they were both insurrectionists in some sense, but they approached the matter differently. Can you talk to us about maybe even the failure of representing Barabbas correctly by a lot of Christians, how you see him and how you contrast him with Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that I argue that in the West in particular, Barabbas has been completely domesticated and distorted in terms of his significance. And so you see a range of moves that people make to try to describe Barabbas. Sometimes he's a crazed serial killer, mental health problems, and they talk about it in really negative ways.
Just so people know, Barabbas was the criminal that Jesus took the place of on the cross. Barabbas was freed. Jesus was crucified.
Right. That's right. And so people will talk about he's cockeyed in some films, drooling at the mouth, laughing uncontrollably, like something's off mentally with him in terms of how he's being depicted. Sometimes he's described as just this serial killer or murderer that just goes town to town for no reason, just murdering people because he's just a sinful person. And then I think the more sophisticated, yet nonetheless distortion of him is the way that many evangelical traditions, though I think even broader than that, but particularly evangelical traditions, cling to using him because they want to argue for substitutionary atonement theology. And so, or penal substitutionary atonement theology.
Yeah.
And so in doing so, they want to describe how Barabbas was sinful and we are like Barabbas and Jesus took his place and all that stuff. And so each of us, and so it's just this use. But what's interesting is that none of those things, none of that is what's said in any of the gospel writers. In fact, they're very consistent about who Barabbas was. Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He participated in the uprisings. He was a revolutionary, what we would call a freedom fighter. And so if that's the case, then we've got to wrestle with why each and every single one of the gospel writers include him. I mean, it's actually pretty amazing that every single gospel writer felt it was necessary to include Barabbas in the Jesus story. If he's this insurrectionist who participated in the uprising, trying to overthrow the Romans who were putting, had their foots on the necks of his people.
Yeah, you even say Barabbas is there 4 times. But Jesus, the birth narrative is only in 2 Gospels.
That's right. I mean, it's more important than that. I mean, why? So clearly he plays a significant role in the story. And Matthew's gospel, who calls him Barabbas infamous, so it's just assumed everybody knows who this guy is, has the longest play out in terms of Jesus and Barabbas. And there, the oldest ancient manuscripts actually have Jesus called Barabbas Jesus Barabbas.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually compare him, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus the Christ, right? And which one do you want? And so there's this choice between Yeshua, Jesus, the one who saves, your liberator, right? Who's going to be your liberator? And really, it's an option not between this violent criminal and a spiritual kingdom. It's both earthly movements that are unfolding here, but one is a nonviolent peacemaking way that is going to usher in God's reign and shalom in society. Absolutely. And one is going to do it in a violent way. But they both share actually quite a bit in common in terms of their concerns around the oppression and the violence and exploitation of their people.
Yeah, I think that's a live question, even in Jesus's mind, you know, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's asking God to take his cup. I wonder, and I've read about this, the possibility that he thought, no, we're going to take up arms against these people that are about to arrest us. You know, Peter even has a sword. And so there's a radical way that Jesus chooses that I think we're following in.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's clear all his disciples are ready to strike with the sword. Mm-hmm. And Peter actually does, is what we're told by John. And so there's no question that the way that Jesus is living and teaching and talking is evoking that kind of radical, zealot kind of response to what's happening. And some people would say that Jesus is confronted with the zealot option, right? Or at least the revolutionary option, violent revolutionary option, that's a live option he's being tempted with. But he remains faithful to the peacemaking way of Jesus, which is why ultimately he ends up being crucified rather than slaughtering everybody else.
You use this term in the book that I want you to unpack, Christian supremacy. And you say Christian supremacy made way for white supremacy. Yeah, just unpack that for a moment, and then we'll get to whether or not we can ever get over this. But just explain that for our audience for now.
Yeah, so when I talk about Christian supremacy, that's my shorthand and try hopefully making sense of the language that we use in more academic circles when we talk about Christendom. This history of the church getting centralized, marrying church and state together through a top-down and imposing itself on society. And so that happens. I mean, usually sometimes people say Constantinian Christianity, tying it to the emperor in the 4th century that ended Christian persecution and began to advantage the church in a whole variety of ways. And then we see that continue on for centuries. And so when I say Christian supremacy, I'm talking about top-down coercive Christianity. I'm talking about a Christianity where the church is advantaged in its position in society, and where Jesus basically has been converted into a mascot for the status quo, right? I mean, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about Christian supremacy. And what I show in the one chapter is how that history, which a lot of people are aware of, literally gives birth to what we could call white supremacy, right? Colonialism actually emerges out of that late medieval world. And so that those Christian supremacist practices are mutating and morphing as people are encountering people from all around the world and are given permission by the church, right? Papal bulls are written. There's official church teachings that give permission to slaughter and to enslave and to pillage in the name of Jesus. These supposedly they called them empty lands, but it just meant unchristian lands when they meant empty lands. And so it's deeply embedded in all of that. And so I think we can see when we think about Christian supremacy, there's no question that in our society today, even though formal Christendom is over and Christianity is certainly declining in some level here in the United States, many people still want Christian supremacy and are trying to pursue Christian supremacy in society, even if they're failing at it.
It is fascinating to see even now a movement from, some people some white supremacists are rejecting Christianity and just holding on to the religion of white supremacy. You know, there's an unusual marriage of even anti-religion white supremacists.
That's right. It took on a life of its own. It doesn't need its host anymore, right? It took on its life of its own, and it's its own religion. It's its own practice in and of itself. I mean, certainly you can find many expressions where they're still tied together, bound tightly, but there's some where it's just pure,
Absolutely.
unadulterated white supremacy.
So a question that we're wrestling with then is, can the American church overcome its unholy marriage to white supremacy and to racism? Is it possible to redeem Christianity, or is it too far gone?
Well, I would say that it was never completely all foregone, because there are always these counter witnesses. And I think the best expressions of them were literally on the underside of the Christian supremacy and the white supremacy. And so I think that the first task that we have is to not consider the failure of white Christianity the failure of Christianity itself, but rather where do we find the places where people were rejecting white supremacy, right, in the church? And that's a live and powerful story to be told in and of itself. And I think just more broadly then, I think that when churches and Christian communities engage or commit to radical discipleship to Jesus, taking Jesus seriously. And by that, I joke sometimes that I can't remember if I have this in the book or not, but my colleague, Richard Crane, he jokes and says, we treat Jesus like our crazy uncle, who, if you go to the family dinner and, Thanksgiving, and you got that one uncle that just says like off the wild, you just buck wild stuff, right? Nobody kind of takes him seriously. That's just Uncle so-and-so. And that's how we treat Jesus. And so what would it mean to actually take Jesus seriously, engage in radical discipleship in the way of Jesus? And to do so, I would say that in the context of white supremacy being so entangled in the life of Christianity and the Christian witness so mangled in the public square, the only way to take up the way of Jesus is to be explicitly anti-empire and decolonizing in the way of Jesus. I mean, I think that just has to be a part of what it means to be Christian in our context. And I think that it also calls us to solidarity with those from the underside who are still being oppressed and exploited. And it calls us to read the gospel alongside those who've been affected most. And most importantly, it means that we got to banish white Jesus, right? And not just the image, because some people want to talk about the image of white Jesus, but our very perception of the kind of mascot for the status quo that doesn't care about the suffering of people and the oppression and vulnerability of people being crushed by those who are in power.
You argue that Jesus himself has gives us the tools and gives us the vocation to do the work you're talking about, that within our faith we can find liberation, salvation, and freedom. How can the local church move toward faithfulness to that vocation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is we got to restore understanding of Christ's preeminence in the church. When religious nationalism runs wild in the church, opening us up to things like Trumpism, I think that we're in trouble. And so I think, what does it mean to regain an understanding that Christ is preeminent? And within that, then a willingness to radically restructure our lives to align with God's reign, to what God is doing, God's deliverance in the world. And I think that's got to include dealing with the power dynamics in the local church. Like sometimes we don't want to name that there are power dynamics at work, and not just in terms of who are the leaders, but all the kind of complex webs of power that are happening in the life of the church in terms of, sometimes folks who give more money have a little more influence and access, or because you have more education, or because, you have the right last name. All these things can factor, because we're all human beings. We got to be able to name and talk about that, and also talk about who has real belonging in the life of the church as well. And then I think the other thing is to really lean into, us as a worshiping community. And what does it mean to be worshiping, the God of justice, the God that we see revealed throughout Scripture, that is unqualified in divine siding with those who are the least, last, and lost of society. How does our worship form us and bring us aware to what God is doing in the world and how we're going to participate in that work? And so I think in the local church, those are some of the things that I think we need to lean into more.
Observing those power structures can be tricky, especially in a context, and in many are Protestant and Anabaptist contexts, where we always talk about flat leadership, where we don't have titles, where there isn't, there's no bishop's collar, there's no robe, so we can't even see even who's in power, and that's a good thing in some ways. I'm a low church guy, but it also allows power to hide.
That's right. And I think the invisible power, I mean, that's where I think in those kind of low church situations, that's what I think has to be paid attention to, that, because that will run wild when the formal structure seems to be flattened, and yet we just imagine that somehow we're in some utopia and other power dynamics are not, unfolding and playing out in our midst. It's a bit naive, right? And I think that sometimes, certainly in Anabaptist communities, there's been some naivete around power dynamics in the life of the church.
You also bring up economic injustice connected to racism, and so this book, just so everyone knows, it's nearly 400 pages, and it's a really holistic view of how to approach being witnesses to the Jesus way. And Drew, you talk about economic injustice as it relates to racism. How is the church complicit in that economic injustice, economic disparity? How do we move in another way? I mean, this is also in the fabric of our society.
Yeah, if we think about the broad scope of the history of our nation, I mean, literally, 250 years of slavery, that was the economy. I mean, sometimes we can't grasp that we went from this minute little colonies to like a world economic power off the backs of Black people, right? Torture of Black people not when we say generations doesn't even seem to capture it. It's centuries, right, of Black people. And so we see after slavery, during the progressive era, as the majority of white people, even as they have benefited from the economy, so their overall well-being is probably better off than what it would have been otherwise, certainly still are poor in terms of what's happening in the broader society and the elites that are hoarding the wealth. So the progressive era actually created policies and government handouts for white people that helped to create what we call now the white middle class. And so there's a whole range of policies and practices, GI bills, FHA loans, all kinds of stuff that happened to help create the white middle class, provide housing, which generated all kinds of wealth, credit, all kinds of stuff. And at the exact same time, Black people were excluded from those things. And so we see this long history going all the way up to the 20th century, and then now new systems of, oppression, mass incarceration and such. But we also see how wealth is continuing to be hoarded, and how Black and brown people, often, especially poor Black and brown people, are being excluded because they're in communities that were engineered to limit access to resources, opportunities, and access into influential institutions. And so, what we're describing is an apartheid system that, basically just hides its hands by tokenizing, right? Having a few Black people in the mix, a few people of color in the mix to hide what it's doing. And the church has been complicit the whole way through, either directly doing it, or at best, the majority have been silent to it and are benefiting, right? Those who are at least dominant cultural Christians have been benefiting from these systems. And so there has been no faithful witness in the way of Jesus in response to this, which is shocking because you can't read the Gospel of Luke without a devastating economic critique, a powerful class consciousness seen in Jesus that is unwavering in his stance in solidarity with the poor and his prophetic witness against the wealthy that hoard their wealth and are not practicing Jubilee ethics.
You have to do a lot of work to read the Gospels and not see the economic implications of following Jesus. That takes a lot of work.
It takes a lot of work. It's actually, I will give them this though, right? It's really creative, intelligent maneuvering. Because I mean, it's hard work to get there.
It's hard work.
It's actually impressive, the fancy systematic moves that people make to skirt and dismiss Jesus's teachings. It's actually quite brilliant what people have come up with.
So this is you got me thinking about something, and I just want your thoughts on it. The majority of poor people in poverty in the United States are white. What do you say to people who insist it's not a class issue, it's not a race issue, bro, it's a class issue? Or they say fighting racism is actually a distraction from our class struggle. How do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that the history that I just told, I think helps to highlight some of the problems with only talking about class, because historically when we've only talked about class and have left race out of the conversation, Black people explicitly have been left out of the story. And so anytime people talk about lifting all boats, usually what it means is white people's boats have been lifted up, right? When you look into the 1800s and you have poor white men who are insisting that they ought to have the right to vote and have access and participation, and that the elites are taking advantage of all the wealth that they have and they're being taxed and not participating in it all. They didn't lift all boats. They lifted white people's boats. And so I think that there's a denial of the way that racism and classism are deeply embedded in the American story. And to honestly engage in dealing with either, you have to deal with the other. And I would also say the same thing, that there's a failure among anti-racists sometimes of adequately dealing with economics and wealth disparities. And I think that is also a problem. And sometimes it's a reflection of middle-class commitments that are not committed to solidarity with those who are poor and oppressed.
Yeah, we might think we're liberated if we have enough billionaires that are people of color too. That doesn't work out exactly.
Right.
Thank you for that. And this book is intense. It tackles a lot of different subjects. Nonviolence is a key idea for Jesus in terms of his political action, as we mentioned before with Barabbas. But how can nonviolence confront police violence and state violence? Is that just a bad idea?
I think that is the initial instinct, right? That this doesn't make any sense. How can we engage these violent forces? And people say, it's no longer time to sit down. We need to stand up, right? And this kind of machismo response to how we deal with violence. And certainly, even in my community, the Black community, there's been more and more folks who are talking about, getting guns and going to the shooting range and stuff. And so they're buying into the logics of mainstream society about both what it means to be a man or what it means to protect our society. But I think that if we actually look closer, it not only does that not make sense, it's a suicide mission. I mean, I think the greater question for me is, why would I want to fight the world's greatest military power, the nation that Dr. King called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, on its own terms? That just seems fairly ridiculous. And so I don't want to engage it on its own terms. And so by nonviolence, what I'm talking about is a strategy that seeks to destroy the unjust systems. But my goal isn't necessarily to destroy the people engaged and captive to those systems as well. And what social science actually says is not only, I could talk about this from my theological commitments and how I got here, but social science actually argues that nonviolence is actually more effective than violence in terms of resistance, right? And so we're seeing actually an increase that right now, I think the numbers that nonviolent movements across the globe under both democracies and dictators are twice as effective as violent ones, and they're growing in effectiveness, and violent resistance is actually decreasing in effectiveness over time as well. So people are actually learning greater ways to engage in strategic nonviolence. Now, the problem is some of the frustration around nonviolence is that so much of it is not strategic nonviolence, right? It's just all we can think of is let's go out and march or let's have a rally, and then we stop there. And it's not necessarily very strategic. And so people get frustrated that nothing's happening. But if we were actually to glean from just the hundreds of different tactics that have been used, more than just the one-hit wonder of going on a march, which has its place at times, but more than just that, I think then we would realize that there are actually really brilliant strategies that can really topple the pillars of power in our society that dominate us. And so ironically, so recently there just came out, and I don't even remember the number, but there was a article that just came out saying that white Christians are actually have decreased in their motivation to respond to racial injustice, right? So there's a decrease in response to seeing Black people killed. They care less about racial injustice. And so some people are discouraged by that. But one of the things that I want to remind people is that, yes, that is discouraging in terms of something's rotten to the core in terms of that kind of faith that would lead you there. But on the other hand, like, we don't need to win everybody over to have a successful movement. Social science also says that you only need 3.5% of the population that is active and sustains in the movement for it to be successful. That it's always successful when you hit that number. Now, 3.5% of the population is not small when you actually think about what that means, but it's also a much more manageable number as well.
Absolutely. That's so this is interesting to me because ethically, morally, theologically, nonviolence is clear to me, biblically too. But you're also saying in terms of efficacious politics, it works as well. So it works. Yeah, that's great. That's encouraging.
And I think that's Jesus actually, it's ironic that, that's Jesus's point in Luke 19, right? He's like, if only you had known the things that make for peace. He's saying there's some things that work. It's interesting that, because sometimes I'll say as an Anabaptist, we kind of put faithfulness against effectiveness sometimes, but sometimes those things converge. And I think this is certainly one of those cases where we see a clear convergence of faithfulness and effectiveness together. And his concern is that those who want to engage in violent revolution, that it's not going to work out, right? And it doesn't. Jerusalem gets destroyed by the Roman powers. And so he's like, here are the kind of practices, the kind of way of life that actually leads to shalom. And I think that that what we're seeing now is that social science actually suggests that is true, that in the long term, it doesn't guarantee any individual situation, right? There's times where violent people will slaughter the innocents, right? But I think in the long run, overall, what we're seeing is that nonviolence is more effective, and I do believe it will win out in the end.
I'm with you. Let's wrap up with love. Another lofty idea. I don't know if you get into this in the book, but Reinhold Niebuhr, would conclude that even though love is the law of Christ, it doesn't really apply itself. It doesn't even land. It doesn't land very well in this context, and so he contrasts it with justice. But how do Christians then engage in love as a way of pursuing justice, not in contrast to it? Talk about that.
Yeah. So for me, instead of leaning on Niebuhr, I lean on King, right? Dr. King, who gleaned from him, right? But didn't buy into his argument quite. And so I think that for me, when I think about love, I think love keeps justice restorative and also has the potential to lead towards beloved community as the end goal, right? So where are we trying to get? And I believe that love is about compassion and action bound together. Love allows for, and this is why it's not just some cutesy like thing that the oppressor wants for the oppressed. Like, love is actually healing and provides internal liberation for the oppressed as they pursue external liberation in their situation. That it does something, it doesn't destroy us on the inside in terms of the kind of people we will be, nor imitating the kind of people that are oppressing us. And so I think, like, for me, King and Thurman are essential for me.
Yeah.
Thurman was brilliant in terms of him helping us see the power of love and the need to resist hatred because of what it will do to the oppressed, right? It will actually destroy your own quality of life. And I think we've got to take that seriously. And then King politicizes that so much more, understanding that love is a powerful weapon. If he argues the strongest and most powerful weapon the oppressed have available to them, powerful enough even to convert even an enemy into a friend, right? And so he's got the long vision for what where he wants society to go, not just a short-term win in the moment. And so, yeah, I think that there's so much more in terms of how love and justice are bound together in ways that I think can be missed. And it's not a mushy sentimentality that we're talking about.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We're coming to our time to end here, Drew, but it's just been so good to hear from you. The book is really it's a great work. Congratulations on the release. You know, for the people listening, Drew really, you know, his commitment to Jesus and the Jesus way as a tool of transformation, as a tool of liberation, is incredible. So it's totally worth your time to read this book. Who Will Be a Witness came out at the beginning of September. My highest recommendation for you. So thanks for being on our show. Is there any way? Tell us how we can keep in touch with you. How do we keep up with what you're doing and what projects you're working on?
Yeah, you can keep up with me. I guess I do social media some. I'm Drew Hart, DRUHART, on Twitter and Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. I also am, I'm not sure if many people know yet, it's slowly getting the word out, is that I'm a co-host for the Inverse podcast with Jared McKenna from Australia, looking at liberative readings of scripture. And
we can subscribe to that too.
Yeah. And let's see. And then, yeah, I'm all over the place. I feel like these days, just guests on different podcasts and dropping in on different Zooms for group studies and stuff. So I'm all over the place these days, not in the same way as pre-COVID, but continue to really value engaging local churches in particular. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Drew. Glad to have you here. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you, Jonny.
All right, it's time for Spiritual Show and Tell. We like to share with you the ways that our souls are getting nourished by God in various ways, from the media that we're consuming to the experiences that we're having. And our hope in doing this is to inspire you to turn your mind to that kind of framing for what's happening in your life. What good and perfect gift is the Father of lights giving you? That's a quote from James. But we're saying that these things that we're getting or that we're going out to get, they nourish our soul and they give us what we need to, have hope for tomorrow and face the difficult work that we've been given to do and survive pandemics and love people who are difficult to love. We need nourishment, y'all, right?
Yes.
So what's nourishing your soul?
Well, watching my son play soccer has been nourishing my soul. That might sound funny, but, in the midst of a pandemic when we've been in the house for a long time and school is over a screen and, social interaction is so limited, being on the field, playing on a team, learning new skills in soccer has just brought him to life. It has nourished my soul to watch him be filled with joy. He loves to run. He loves to be fast, and getting coached into new skills, learning new things is really exciting to him. He wants to watch YouTube videos. He wants to go out back and practice. He's got a ball. He's really not supposed to be playing in the house, but he's trying to practice new skills in the living room. After months of this pandemic, it really is bringing me joy to see something that's giving my kid some life. And it just reminds me how we all need that. Learning something new, getting outside, using our bodies really does help us stay healthy.
It makes me think of Chariots of Fire. This is one of my favorite lines in movie history. When
I run, I feel God's pleasure.
I feel God's pleasure when I run. Yeah. He also made me fast. Look that up. Chariots of Fire. Go watch that. I didn't watch it this week, so I can't say it's nourishing my soul, but I can see Isaiah, running to that soundtrack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really life-giving to learn new things in this time that can feel monotonous. I have been reading The Critical Journey by Janet O. Hagberg, and it is definitely nourishing my soul. It's about stages of faith, stages in our faith development, and she kind of connects it. It's loosely connected to her book on stages of power, but the stages of faith are like the recognition of God, then the life of discipleship, the productive life, the journey inward, and then you hit a wall, this place of inner choices before you get to the journey outward and the life of love. But I was talking with a friend about the wall yesterday, and he gave me this great feedback about, like, isn't every day a wall in the spiritual life? Like, don't we hit a wall every day in deciding to go deeper with God or not? And I just thought that encouraged me that, like, yeah, this journey with God is happening every day. We always have a choice, but always the grace of God kind of calling us forward and onward.
My soul has been nourished by an unusual thing for me. My children behaved well enough to finally earn a fish tank. And so I'm becoming an aquarist. And
is that a word? Aquarist?
It's definitely a word. It's someone who takes care of aquariums.
I would say aquariumist. That would be my first guess. But yeah, I'm trusting you.
I don't know many of them, so Jonny, tell us about it.
So when you're taking care of a community of fish, you have to get the right kinds to be together that don't attack each other. It's a peaceful community. I like to call it a peaceable community because that's another word I like. And they get along. They're relating. There's not a lot of aggression happening. And getting the water right, making Philly tap water into, like, I don't know, fish style water. Takes some chemistry. You got to test things out and add certain things and make the environment work. And then the fish undergo stress when they change environments. And so you got there's fish in a bag, and then you got to make sure that the water in that bag doesn't go into the new environment and mess up the chemistry of it. And so it takes some care and thought. And creating an environment where life can thrive nourishes my soul, because I think as a pastor and as a follower of Jesus, I'm trying to do that everywhere, mm-hmm. and to try and fail. That's okay too. It doesn't always work. We lost some fish in the process, and that's just part of life, part of how it all works. So I think that, I'm not a fisher person. Like I don't go collecting fish with like a fishing pole or a net like Jesus' disciples were. But that energy of being someone oriented with fish in general, I'm channeling now, even though I'm taking care of them. So I feel like it is teaching me how to take care of this peaceable community that we have in Circle of Hope too.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. It's great. Well, I'm going to cheat and do two, because I just saw another one of the things out my window that is nourishing my soul. Bruce and Phyllis and Baby Shark are back at Newton Lake. Those are the names that we gave the swans that live on our lake this time of year.
Bruce
and Phyllis were the first, and then they had a baby. And Owen Larimore, who at the time was like 2, named the other one Baby Shark. And Baby Shark is now like a brownish it's like a full-size swan, but it's still like looks dirty because it's only a year old. It's a fledgling still, but they're back. They're still hanging out, and that's so cool that they like migrated somewhere for the summertime, and they stuck together, and they're back on my lake at like clockwork. It's so weird the way the world works like that, and they're sticking together as a family across thousands of miles as they migrate, and they're back at Newton Lake just like they were. Bruce and Phyllis, they came back, just the pair of them, regularly for years, but now Baby Shark is part of the equation, and that is awesome. And I'll just get a quick shout out to Villa Pauline Retreat Center, which was a retreat center that is open during the pandemic. They're not, I love going on retreat, and some of my go-to spots, they're just not trying to figure out how to do that safely. I respect them for that, but I really needed to go on retreat. I just needed to get away. So I drove all the way to Mendenham, New Jersey, where Villa Pauline Retreat Center is. It's on the property of a convent of the Sisters of Charity. And it was a beautiful place and super schmancy. I didn't tell you all about this yet, but it was like the neighborhood was just full of multi-million-dollar homes, and the estate that the sisters own, I'm sure, is worth multi-million dollars because of the real estate, but even some of the buildings that are on there are pretty amazing. I stayed in like this like 1800s house that was incredible. It was weird because normally I stay in a hut. But it was good to get away, and I liked the distance that it was. Like, it was a real separation to like take the hike and get up there, because I really needed to just spend some time alone with God, and I got nourished there.
Excellent.
That's our show for today, y'all. So glad to be with you. Thanks for sharing everything. Thanks for interviewing Drew, Jonny, and for bringing this all together. Johnny's like our quarterback, y'all. Did you know that? Take us out, Jonny.
Yeah, thanks you, Ben. It's I love doing this, and I want more people to experience it. So share this around. Let someone else hear it. We wanna bless as many people as we can. So if you want to talk back to us too, Resist and Restore podcast at circleofhope.net. That's how you reach out to us. So we're looking forward to hearing from you too. See you next time.